mean, they're of course selling mainly Japanese books, but the only foreign language books they sold were German books, because that was the legacy of the pre-war period, and German was the lingua franca of scholarship. This changes very drastically. So if you walk around the University of Tokyo today, or for that matter, Seoul National University or National Taiwan University, it's very hard to find a German reader. Almost non-existent, except in German department. Instead, what you get is English everywhere. So one of the things that happens is that these universities actually don't have access to the past of their scholarship in any way. And if you don't believe me, you can just look at old scholarly articles. The primary foreign language records is in German. But these have all been forgotten. And only ones who survive are those who have been translated into English. But this push was actually somewhat limited. It was either in these global South countries, like Turkey and Egypt, or in East Asia, actually. But in the past decade, actually Americanization has proceeded much more rapidly and has begun to colonize Europe as well. Part of the reason, of course, is just kind of a generic process of globalization. I mean, there is a sense in which the world is becoming slightly more homogeneous because of better communication and so on. But the real reason for what one might call institutional isomorphism, this idea that things begin to look alike, actually lies out elsewhere. And I actually believe, I've never actually written this paper, so I can't really quite prove it, but the real change comes about roughly 10 years ago, in 2005 or so, when Shanghai Jiaotong Dashi creates this first, I'm sorry, I couldn't do the traditional characters, but they published the first ranking of world universities. And they came up in the latest version with this ranking. And also, a year later, Times Higher Educational Supplement produced the same sort of ranking. The Newsweek began to do it, and there are others. And somewhat surprisingly, or not surprisingly, the same universities continue to appear in the top 5 and top 10. This makes them feel comfortable. But I'll talk more about survey that later, or actually now. It's actually a very strange idea, right? Because until 2003 or so, when Shanghai Jiaotong people started doing this survey, it didn't really occur to anyone to compare universities across national borders. I mean, occasionally you have people saying, is it really better to go to Cambridge or Harvard? But of course, it depends on your field. Maybe the greatest theoretical physicist is in Cambridge. Or perhaps not. Maybe she or he is at Caltech. Or perhaps at National Taiwan Universities. Who knows? And one of the reasons people didn't bother was basically that people just thought that universities did different things. Countries were different. Even within country, universities are very different. And so what's the point of comparing apples and oranges? They're just different. And more obviously, we have these measurement people here, but it was not that obvious how you can measure the university. Its effectiveness, its productivity, especially if you start to realize that the main function in most places was teaching. I mean, is it better to teach 500 students in one class because you're efficient? Or is it better that you're old style Oxford and have tutorials and have one-on-one teaching sessions? I mean, if I were a business person, a businessman who owned the universities, I want this professor to teach 500 students. It's more efficient. But to be a truly great university, I might think, although it's very expensive, maybe it's better to be like the old style Oxford, where a tutor would sit down with a 2T student, one-on-one, and have a discussion for an hour. So largely, most people who have any interest in this sort of thing found that incommensurable. When people drank late at night and had nothing else to talk about, they might start comparing. But by and large, I think almost no one did this sort of thing. The second and more problematic part of the measurement is that, of course, it's very deeply ethnocentric, because what defines excellence is really American research universities' idea of excellence, which is to be a research institution. And of course, the measurement is largely done, or actually only done, on English language journals. So if you are working in the Russian sphere of influence, Chinese sphere of influence, then these measurements, they might argue, it's completely unfair. And though it's not true today, I mean, there are times when Russian physics and math were very good. It's not as true anymore, actually. Just as, in German, they published many things in German, which were very, very important, that the Nobel Prize and so on. However, people stop worrying about problems. People don't worry about problems, about measurement and surveys. People love lists. This is very clear. And once you make ranking into a thing, it has its own dynamic. And the most important dynamic was that it sent a shockwave throughout the world of universities, especially in Germany and Japan. And I would argue that if you were to rank countries in terms of research excellence, if you could do these things, I would argue actually that in 1980s and 1990s, or as of 2003 or so, Germany and Japan would have been number 2 and 3 after US. I mean, people disagree, but anyway, I think that's the case. But both in Germany and Japan, this ranking was shocking. No German university was in top 50. No German university. Only 2 Japanese universities were in top 50. Actually, it was actually shockwave throughout the world. It's interesting. I was Dean of International Studies then at Berkeley. So one of my job was to kind of meet presidents of universities and ministers of education around the world. And when the ranking came out in 2005 from Times Higher Education Supplement, I actually met many of these people. And what was interesting was that it's not just the Japanese and Germans were shocked. I mean, people in China were shocked because none of their universities made top 100. I mean, even people in Malaysia were shocked because the University of Malaya, they thought was a really great institution. I mean, I don't want to make fun of University of Malaya, but it's a university which in the library doesn't even provide access to JSTOR. So it can't be such a great research university. But nonetheless, I know for a fact that the Vice Chancellor, it's kind of an English model, thought genuinely that this university was in 100. What happens then is it creates state intervention. Because the bureaucrats and politicians start debating what's wrong. Right. And so both Germany and Japan started what in German was called, you don't have to know much German to realize what it means, excellence initiative. And Japanese, in their English translation, did something called excellence initiative. Same thing. Essentially, they wanted to pour money into top German and top Japanese universities. And also at the same time, the bureaucrats insisted that universities should reform. Now, this may have almost no interest to you, but the thing about Germany is that there are really probably 10 to 20 truly great universities. It's just that they're pretty much, they're kind of equal. I mean, University of Heidelberg and Tübingen and, Free University in Berlin, the whole University in Munich, I mean, they're all excellent, actually. It's just that none is so much better than the other. They're kind of roughly equal. And it's very good. It serves Germans much better to be this way. Japan, too, even though it is hierarchical, right? They have these 7 national universities. Though hierarchical, Tokyo University is excellent, Kyoto University is excellent, so on and on. But German and Japanese education bureaucrats, would get people like me to try to make their university system more American. And because I said, German university system was fine, they fired me after about a month, actually. Anyway. So, they wanted to globalize, which meant only that they wanted to Americanize. And they wanted to be excellent, which meant they wanted to be more American. Okay. What's wrong with this? Well, as I tried to tell people, they didn't listen, so it's kind of pointless. But I'll tell you, in case you're interested. There's a real problem to being a major research university like UC Berkeley. In the initial ranking, Berkeley ranked #2, which is one of the reasons I was invited everywhere. I mean, Berkeley is a very strange institution because it's a public university and has a very serious commitment throughout the university to being open and providing access to everyone. By access, I mean it should be available to poor people, it should be available to ethnic minorities, so on and on. And it's also part of not just the UC system, which is 10 campuses, but also Cal State system and community colleges. Now, what I'm going to say though is that yes, because it's mainly a graduate school, and because it's so research focused, it does very well. So if you compare to Harvard, a famous university in Cambridge, Mass, right? Even though people think Harvard's so much better, actually in departmental rankings, I mean almost every major department actually ranks higher than Berkeley, including sociology. It's not great. Well, anyway, but sorry, mistake here. Yeah, but what is the problem? Well, one, I mean, I think Berkeley people are not listening, but there really isn't much stress on undergraduate education. There are 25,000 of them, 25,000 undergraduates. And they don't get paid much attention. I mean, university has crumbling infrastructure. Meaning that, I mean, your classroom is not very clean either, but, but I would bring these people, bureaucrats and university presidents, and show them classrooms, because at least your chairs, I mean, you can sit and they are stable. In Berkeley, I mean, these things are broken. Painting has not been repainted in probably 3 decades. Windows have not been cleaned in about 20 years. We don't have even things like this. I have to bring my own laptop. It's just a horrible, horrible infrastructure. Why is that? Well, it's not a poor university. It's a rich university. But it spends all its money on research, not teaching. We know more of all. It's good. It's filthy. And yet, even though we don't spend any money or spend much effort on undergraduate education, tuition has escalated in the last 30 years. So by now, actually it's like here now. It's increasing rapidly. Why is that? Well, in part because state support is declining. But another reason is because research is very expensive. Just very, very costly enterprise. And though it's nice for me, for example, or my colleagues to write articles and books, it adds to the reputation of the universities, I suppose, but it's very hard to say why it's that important to spend all this money in research. So anyway, enough about problems. You might now want to ask, why has U.S. university become dominant? I really think, it is stronger in many ways. The usual reasons are not completely false. Most people think it's just because U.S. universities have most money. Tuitions are higher, American universities get gifts, donations. It's true. But I actually think that's not the real reason. There's one good reason, which is that American educational system has a fundamental paradox at its heart. If you ever look at comparative test scores of primary and secondary schools, elementary school students, high school students, Americans do very badly. Math, geography, what have you. There are some excellent schools, but they tend to be either in very rich areas or private schools. Pretty much the same thing. The school system isn't very good, but in part because it's not very good, of course, it creates, or it has room for individual creativity, I think. That's true. It is true, because no one teaches very well. It's very interesting. But the real reason U.S. educational system ranks so high at the higher level actually is because American universities import talent. By importing talent, it just means that university actually, once you step inside, isn't full of Americans. It's actually full of foreigners. Meaning that in one sense, Americans, or universities like Berkeley, is a free rider. It's not paying, because all these great scientists, engineers, and so on, were trained and educated in places like Taiwan. Your parents or grandparents paid these tax dollars to create very good public schools, and yet they went to graduate school in the US and stayed, and if they were good, they got hired by Berkeley, and it contributes now to Berkeley's renown, reputation, and in general, American economic dynamism. So America benefits from the fact that it's just as a peculiar policy towards immigration, which is very open, and so can take advantage of great education system everywhere. So, for example, one of the more curious factoid information that I know is, who is the foreign populations in Microsoft? I know it's not the most famous company now, but Microsoft is a very dynamic and very big company. I'm not going to make you guess, but the country that sends the second most number of employees to Microsoft, and by employees I don't mean janitors and cleaners, but people who do programming, is Romania. Now, Romania is not really known as a powerhouse of computer science, right? But it has actually a very good system, teaches very well, right, at the university level, and sends its best and brightest to the U.S. So U.S. benefits of all the money that Romanian government people spend training all these people. And so what happens is that Americans have taken advantage of the globalization of the labor market. If you go to Germany and Japan, for example, most faculty members are German or Japanese, almost all. There are a couple countries, like Austria and Singapore, which don't have actually strong educational systems. Singapore does. But their universities do very well. And again, the reason is, in Austrian universities, or National University of Singapore, there are foreigners. And the same is true for student body. So what happens is that in the perceived struggle, the fittest survive. And the fittest survive not because Americans invest, right? But they simply take advantage of investments made by others. And they do so simply by generating what we might call meritocratic system, that no one cares where someone comes from. It really doesn't matter. And let me give you one small example. This is just a sample of electrical engineering faculty. Now, I mean, it's not always a sure guide, but if you look at the last name, I think you'll give a sense, right? I mean, there are electrical engineers from Greece, Armenia, India, Taiwan, right? There's actually only one country I think that's not represented, the US. So I took, if you go to many departments at Berkeley and ask, if you ask people, when's the last time a native-born American was hired? Actually, many people don't remember, and to the extent they think they're Americans, they're usually immigrants. Right? I mean, it says a lot about the U.S. So anyway, there are of course other factors that are important. I mean, in some ways, all the universities have historic strength. Right? English is very important, so English language areas do better. And I would argue most importantly, if you are ahead at a certain point, it's easier to stay ahead, especially in terms of publications in journals, because people at these elite institutions get to define what's important. What is research excellence? Right? I mean, most of you are not. Some of you may be interested in graduate school or are in graduate school already. But one of the hardest things is, of course, to figure out what's an interesting problem. Because you have to work in an interesting problem very often to get published in the top journal, right? And yet what's interesting, of course, is not necessarily objective. I mean, it's not, dictated by God or anything like that. It's dictated largely by the leaders in particular leading institutions. And so they get to decide. And who knows what they decide? Well, them and their friends and their students. So if you're outside, you have absolutely no idea, except by reading journals. But by the time journal articles are published, it's 2 or 3 years later. And very often it's too late. People in the leadership positions have moved on. And at the same time, people who decide on reputation actually are at these institutions, elite institutions already. So these reputational surveys are done by surveys. And essentially they send these surveys to people like me, and I fill them up. And what universities I think are best, I actually don't really know the answer. So I guess, and I guess usually the places I've been. So 3 days ago, it's not here. This QS World Survey asked me what I thought were the 10 greatest universities that do social science research, and I decided that National Taiwan University is here. I mean, I don't know. Maybe it's true, but anyway. So this new global university, as I mentioned, has the U.S. model. And the fundamental way in which it operates is simply by emulation. It just kind of copies what the leaders are doing. And in so doing, creates the same kind of institutions everywhere. Everyone wants to be a bit like Harvard or Stanford. Historically, of course, there are different ways in which these emulations occurred. Sometimes colonial government, right, would just create one, Tokyo University, and create model in Taipei. Or sometimes missionary consultants come and create something. Or there are converts, meaning people who go abroad and study what the leading universities in the world are like and try to create them in their own country. But what happens in this process? Well, what happens is the very conditions that sustain the hierarchy of global reputation in university ranking, meaning that English becomes the lingua franca. Right? So some countries, have taken this very, very far. So if you go to leading South Korean universities in South Korea, the only publications that count are publications in English. If you publish in Korean, it doesn't count. You write a book in Korean, it doesn't count. Journal article in Korean, it doesn't count. Actually, it's even worse. Very often, they want English language publication in SSCI journal, Social Science Citation. If it's not in SSCI journal, it doesn't exist. Similarly, in this process, what they do is join this Eurocentric world of science or scholarship. There's a kind of a prestige structure so that everyone is keen to emulate what goes on in the perceived center. So this is another process by which even the humanities get enrolled in this very bizarre process. So to give you a very, very strange example, I'll just give you the South Korean example because it's the most clear and the most absurd. So you would think if you're studying Korean literature, for example, very few people outside of Korea read Korean, right? You would think all the Korean universities would be the leading institutions. They all read Korean. But no, it doesn't work that way because they don't publish in English language journals. So increasingly, they want to send their top students to US or elsewhere. Why? They can then publish in English. And this is true not just in languages and literature, but also history and others. You don't count if you do your native thing. You don't even get hired. And this trend is sweeping through China. And Chinese have gone the second fastest, I think, in this trend. By China, I mean mainland China, of course. Japan and Taiwan, I think, are slow to respond. In part because I think they're more sane, but I don't know what will happen. So, increasingly then, the trends that have happened before become accentuated. So if you're a German university or a Japanese university, it doesn't really matter. They want to have the same kind of departments and give the same kind of degrees. Why? Well, they want to be ranked higher. And they want to be recognized by their peers around the world. In most German universities, the head used to be called rector. Right? It's just a historical term for the leader of the university. But rectors want to change their title. Why? Well, when they go to China, or when they go to Taiwan, or US, or Mexico for that matter, no one knows what a rector is. But everyone knows what a rector is. Everyone around the world. Something very impressive. Similarly, everyone wants to be a professor now. In many European institutions, say UK for example, there was a very centuries-old hierarchy. There was usually only one professor, there's a reader, senior lecturer, and so on. But most leading US universities, UK universities are changing this. Why? Well, they want to be like Americans. And when you go to international conferences, if you are a senior lecturer, you feel bad. Because in the US, a senior lecturer is a temporary teacher. Who are hired on term-to-term contract. So they think you must be a loser. And so they say, but if I'm an associate professor, everyone will know that I'm tenured, and that I must be very important. So on and on. So I think you understand how this system works. Right? Once this gets rolling, the administration wants you to act and work in a certain way, the individual professors also want that insert. Yeah. But there's a very, very dark side of the story, because the Global Research University is actually so different from either Newman's University, kind of a place where universal knowledge is taught, or even von Humboldt's idea of modern research university, which was for personal cultivation and nation building. Increasingly, the hierarchy of faculties has changed again.